McDonald's, for the first time, is having a... I'm at Mickey D's twice a week. People see me there. No, they're having their first spin-off restaurant. I love this. It's called Cosmix. Get it? It's Cos and then Mix. Okay. Cosmix. And really what it is that Gen Z apparently thinks McDonald's is corny, which it is, but it's supposed to be, okay? So they're trying to come up with a new restaurant that's McDonald's, but for the under 30 crowd. And we got a hold of their, I mean that, we got a hold of their, I say that a lot of times and they think I'm kidding. There actually was restaurant is not there yet, but somebody got a hold of their menu. Menu items include a chai frappe, burst, a creamy avocado tomatillo sandwich, a pomegranate hibiscus slush, and a turmeric spice latte. That's what's been going on at the new Cosmix McDonald restaurant.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, February the 3rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
I would criticize Keynes as having an empty anthropology altogether. Flawed anthropologies lead to flawed economic policy, and you can see this flawed anthropology today in the Fed's dual mandate of full employment and price stability. This isn't economics as deep moral theory anymore. This is economics as a video game. How can we tinker with the federal funds rate in order to manipulate the scoreboard with all the macroeconomic variables on it to get the outcomes that we like and that make us look good? When we forget about the individuals who are trying to make plans. And sometimes those top-down policy actions frustrate the individual decision-making that happens at the more personal level. Victor Clark. You will notice that he takes on a lot of topics here. The anthropology of Keynesianism, the lack of wisdom in the dual mandate of the Fed, attempts to top-down control the economy, etc. But ultimately, everything comes down to one thing here: the impediments to human action that stem from top-down interventionism. And I do not merely mean impediments to efficiency, logistical impediments, and neither does Clark. Above all else, policy actions that frustrate human action take grave risk in impeding the cause of human flourishing.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
When in fact, we're the ones who don't want you to know. But I'll never tell. And so we merrily sorted through Black history's 500 years, keeping Crispus Attucks, after all, He was one of the first black victims. But short-selling Austin Dabney, a slave in Georgia who took up arms against the British during the Revolution, and for his bravery was rewarded with his own land and a federal pension at a time when blacks were forbidden to own property. We kept W.E.B. Du Bois, the scion of a prominent mixed-race family in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, who founded the NAACP, became a communist and eventually returned to Africa, dying in Ghana at the age of 95, and jettisoned Booker T. Washington, the bastard child of a white slaveholder and a black slave woman, who pulled himself up from slavery, dined with the Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, in the White House, in an event that infuriated the Southern Democrats, and founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where he eventually worked himself to death in his lifelong struggle to better black America through education and hard work. We kept Michael Jackson, a self-mutilated child molester of whom it was once said that only in America could a poor black boy grow up to be a rich white woman, and disappeared Scott Joplin, one of the most important figures in the history of American popular music, and the man who not only invented ragtime, but memorialized the meeting between Booker T and TR in an opera, now alas lost, called A Guest of Honor. Joplin invented or adumbrated every single strand of what evolved into American popular music of the 20th century, and it is certainly safe to say that without him, there would have been no Michael Jackson, which I suppose is the only bad thing you can say about a man born to a freed slave, educated in the bordellos of the Mississippi River, and who forged a synthesis of American and European musical strains to create something unique, the voice of modern America. Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, Jesse Owens, James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Frederick Douglass. That just begins to call the honor roll of black achievement in America, which of course is as long and glorious as any other groups, and was accomplished under unmatched strictures. And they did it all without us. And I can hear you now. In a rational world, that would be our focus, wouldn't you think? With a history like that, it's a wonder the black community tolerates us at all. That's the stuff your bunch likes to talk about, all part of your mindless celebration of American history in general. But that would be judgmental, cheering only the best. What we want you to do is accept the worst. Not the heroes, but the criminals. Not the men and women of all races and classes who helped create the country you live in today, but the men and women who have done everything in their power, whether through malice, indolence, indisposition, or hostility, to ruin it. Tolerance no longer asks you not to judge a man by the color of his skin. In fact, it does precisely the opposite. It requires you to notice the color of his skin, and if he's doing anything illegal or destructive, to ignore his actions. That is the real meaning of the word tolerance today. As you can see, we've flipped it, which is always part of our arsenal against you. No sooner have we gotten you to accept a premise, which may in itself be innocuous, or on rare occasions actually beneficial to everybody, than we start twisting it, revisiting it, modulating it, until by the time we're finished, it bears almost no resemblance to what it originally started out as, except in the most superficial way. And by the time you've figured this out, by the time you timorously raise your hand to lodge a small, tiny really, practically infinitesimal objection, it's way too late. Once you've accepted the premise, you're all ours. Let's take a sprint through the recent past to see how this works. Remember back in the 1950s, before women entered both college and the workforce in such large numbers that today they constitute the majority of college students? Boys are the co-eds now, and dominate many fields, including journalism. When Dad put on his hat and went off to work, and Mom stayed at home with the kids, the breadwinner and the homemaker working together in partnership, the children getting the benefit of maternal love and attention, and learning to respect their father for the sacrifices he made in order to provide for his family? Remember that? Well, neither do I. And as far as I'm concerned, it's probably just one of those phony cultural myths your side derived from television shows like Leave It to Beaver. But there certainly must be some reason why half a century ago, a single man could earn enough money to support a wife and multiple children, not just one designer kid, build or buy a house in the suburbs, like Scarsdale and Pelham and Cleveland Heights and Dearborn and Berkeley and Encino. There must be a reason why after women went into the workforce in a big way in the 1970s, 2 incomes suddenly became the equivalent of 1. 4 kids became 2 kids, divorce soared, and after Roe v. Wade in 1973, 2 kids became 1 kid became no kids. There must be a reason why crime rates were at historic lows, why kids could play outside during the summer from just after breakfast until the streetlights came on, why they felt perfectly safe riding their bikes all over town, taking the subway from Queens to Harlem and back again, and hitching rides on cable cars in San Francisco and hanging off the sides just for laughs. There must be a reason why boys didn't punch girls, why real men didn't curse in public, why wives wore dresses and even gloves, why men wouldn't think to appear in the workplace without a suit or at least a jacket and tie. And this was before the word workplace was even invented. Why there were not multiple lawsuits after every water cooler joke. But to ask these questions would be reactionary. That's some word, isn't it? And one of our favorites, right up there with revanchist, and even racist somehow. Don't ask me how, we'll find a way. Probably in consultation with the New York Times op-ed writers. I know the answer we'd give you if you were dumb enough to make these assertions in public anymore. What about the civil rights movement? It's the answer we always give every time one of you wingnuts starts getting all weepy for the good old days. Which, as we all know, were hell on earth. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And begin to reminisce how you should have seen the Atlantic Ocean back then. It was some sight. The civil rights movement is the ultimate trump card for all of you longing for the Garden of Eden you remember America being during the Eisenhower administration. And it's such a simple syllogism that even a young pioneer could do it in his sleep. 1. Fact. The Civil Rights Act didn't happen until 1964. 2. Premise. Therefore, this was an evil country until 1964. 3. Faulty conclusion. Ergo, nothing that America did or was until 1964 could possibly be any good, as long as this one monstrous wrong remained unrighted. To which, of course, you lot nod your heads and stroke your beards, and suddenly shout, "My God, Mildred, don't you see we've been living a lie all these years? Let's kill ourselves in expiation of the sins of our fathers." And that's it. You're done. No nuance, no looking at history. Heck, not even an acknowledgement that Martin Luther King Jr. was a registered Republican, as most black people were up to the 1960s. At one stroke, and no matter the merits of the actual facts, we have reframed the argument on our terms, made America's entire history hostage to the legacy of slavery, and cut the legs out from under you, our opponents. And the genius of it is, the argument isn't even about the civil rights movement, about which no one would disagree. The discussion is over, the science is settled, the voters have spoken. And now it's on to Chicago and let's win in November. Falsus in unum and all that jazz. This all-purpose reproach allows us to trash just about every icon and institution in the United States. We've turned the all-American dad into a doofus figure of fun. We've gotten you to loathe stay-at-home moms, celebrate pregnant teenagers, cheer on their abortions, and sue the doctors when they botch them. We've convinced you that kids are smarter than their parents, the poor are more virtuous than the rich, and that all cultures are equal. We demanded that you tolerate it, and you did. Chesterton, or some other religious nut, may have said that tolerance is the only virtue left to the man who no longer believes in anything. But so what? Tolerance is the only virtue you need while we cannibalize your culture. And when we're finished, well, you won't need it anymore. And so it has fallen to us to right the wrongs of the past 2,000 years of the Common Era. Thank Gaia that superstitious AD nonsense is a thing of the past, and we didn't even have to sue anybody to get rid of it. By legislating and suing you out of existence. By tying you down with a million petty regulations until everything you do, say, or even think will be subject to prophylactic reflection before you do, say, or think it. We've won. And now you're about to experience the consequences of how much we dislike you. Herbert Marcuse was right in repressive tolerance. The only thing we can't tolerate is you.
And that was Chapter 16 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the latest from the Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 26. The retrograde must use Saul Alinsky's shrewdest, trickiest rules for radicals against the radicals themselves. We will examine how to specifically reverse two of his rules, 4 and 13. Respectively, these two rules read, make the enemy live up to his own book of rules, and pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. First, let's polarize Alinsky's Rule 4. Make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Alinsky admits openly that he was inspired, naturally or supernaturally, by the tactics of the devil, who simply cherishes the contempt of hypocrisy. According to both scripture and tradition, Lucifer was and is fascinated by both the concept and the implementation of hypocrisy, employing it wherever opportune on his own behalf and pointing it out in others whenever expedient, which of course indicates his implementation of a sort of meta-hypocrisy, a hypocrisy within hypocrisy. No surprise, then, that Alinsky's favorite tactic involved decrying hypocrisy and anything else looking like hypocrisy in his political opponents. Every American general election cycle, radicals across the land furiously forage the political landscape for any and all indicia of the slightest instance of hypocrisy by the religious right, which they find, of course, since all humans make mistakes. What's truly diabolic in this modus operandi is the startling consequence that Americans have generally given purchase to the radical lie that an act of hypocrisy by Party A equates to an automatic score for his rival, Party B. Naturally, the consequence of unintelligent voter behavior continues to incentivize radicals to weaponize hypocrisy. We must turn the tide by making radicals meet muster, a double twist to be sure. In other words, force the enemy to live up to his own rules, about enemies living up to their own rules. In order to accomplish this, Christians must become more adept at weaponizing the radical concept of equality. Radical impunity against Christians, in the name of equality, violates justice. Retrogrades must resolve this abuse of so-called equality for themselves. For example, consider the radical community organizing effort from 2012 until 2017 that resulted in the temporary coercion of Christian bakers in Colorado to produce cakes for celebrants of homosexual civil unions, until the Court of Appeals holding was overturned in the Supreme Court in 2018 in favor of the bakeries. Supposedly value-neutral jurisprudence in America, such as the decidedly anti-Christian holding by the Court of Appeals, has never actually been neutral, notwithstanding its claims. Without other opinions, the retrograde must negate the enemy's legal tactics culturally. He must do this by showing that, one way or another, an immoral application of one of the rules for radicals against a Christian can easily be weaponized by that same Christian. In the absence of an eventual overturn by the Supreme Court, Christian bakers might have ironically employed Alinsky's Rule 4 by posting signs in their bakeries saying, all profits from wedding cakes for homosexual civil unions will be diverted exclusively to heteronormative religious causes. This would classify as a defensive tactic, as it rebuffs prospectively against enforceable requests by homosexuals for wedding cakes. Sure enough, between 2012 and 2017, Christian cake shops might have been legally required to violate their Christian scruples, but this way, at least they could use the profits to strike against the very occasion of the radicals' oppression. More importantly, their signs would likely have deterred homosexuals from requesting, i.e. requiring, them to provide such cakes. The radical insistence on a certain type of equality under the law would, in that case, work in favor of Christians for once. The Christian baker would have successfully reversed Alinsky's Rule 4, even in the face of legal defeat. Alinsky's Rule 13, being offensive rather than defensive, allows for a more aggressive response to the same circumstances. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Operating on the basis of Rule 13 from 2012 until 2017, the retrograde might have struck back, locating and then patronizing bakeries run by radical anti-Christian homosexualists and forcibly requesting Christian and heteronormative-themed wedding cakes. This would be the retrograde's more ambitious way of affirming the exclusivity of man-woman marriages. Pick the target, i.e., an opposition bakery, personalize the message, and polarize what they attempted to do to Christians. The radical left won't live and let live, so why should we? Forcible viewpoint discrimination in the realm of baker harassment cuts both ways, after all. The retrograde must see to it that it does. While the Supreme Court eventually rendered the issue moot in 2018, the hot-button issue of Christian bakeries and homosexual wedding cakes provided an excellent opportunity to exercise the retrograde's moral imagination. It will prove both necessary and worthwhile to anticipate what retrogrades may do, defensively and offensively, in a foreseeable day to come, when the ultimate holding may not be as innocuous to Christians as that rendered by Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission 2018. In practice, abiding this rule of Alinsky's 13 serves to cross-reference the rule for retrogrades enjoying a perennial offensive counterattack. The reader can plainly see how much more effective the offensive application of Alinsky's rules are than the defensive. Once more, always be on offense.
And that was Rule 26 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left from Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Chapter 5. Commandment number 4. Never surrender the moral high ground. The charismatic preacher approaches the podium. The crowd eagerly anticipates his words of inspiration. Inwardly, they know their cause is just, but their external resolve needs one more proverbial boost of confidence from their leader before they carry on the fight for civil rights against discrimination and oppression, anxiously awaiting their marching orders. They're stunned to hear their leader say the following: "Ladies and gentlemen, we know it is wicked and evil for a man created in the image of God to oppress his fellow image bearer just because the color of his skin is different. We know that our Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, which means we are all made in the image of Creator God, and are therefore guaranteed freedom thusly. However, the courts have ruled in Dred Scott that we are property after all, and in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal is the law of the land. Given that, until we control a majority of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, we'll never be able to have civil rights. So in the meantime, we have to take the best deal that we can get. That's why today, I'm urging you to back legislation that will stop the lynchings of the elderly. At the very least, we can stop late-term discrimination, when even some vicious racists oppose the lynching of the infirm. We can't stop all discrimination, but half a loaf is better than none. Besides, the person who believes in equality 80% of the time isn't a 20% racist." Boy, that'll preach. Way to fire up the troops there, Coach. Does that sound like the bold vision and strategy that carried the civil rights movement to victory? But before you start thinking my example sounds utterly asinine, which it does, keep in mind the hypothetical speech I just wrote has essentially been the message of the movement fighting against the most grave injustice in our contemporary society: the shedding of innocent blood. There is nothing more evil for a culture than to turn its back on its most vulnerable and its next generation. Only a culture drowning in self-loathing would voluntarily extinguish its best and brightest before they're even born. Child killing via abortion has cost over 50 million Americans their lives over the past 40 years. which are more American casualties than every war this country has fought in combined. Beyond the human toll is the societal one. Who knows which of those dead children might have one day discovered the cure for cancer, AIDS, or even the common cold, or maybe have discovered a clean form of energy that sparked a second industrial revolution. On a smaller, more personal scale, who knows if one of those dead children would have saved you or a loved one's life one day. But now, they won't be there to do that. I once saw a pro-education commercial pointing out that every high school dropout had the potential to do something special for society. And now that they're gone from school, that potential is essentially wasted, given what happens to most dropouts. Yet the same could certainly be said for every aborted baby as well. Not to mention, this level of internal carnage rots away at the soul of a nation, to the point that life becomes less valued overall. In 2012, a jury in Portland, Oregon, awarded a couple $3 million in a wrongful birth lawsuit because the hospital failed to prenatally identify their unborn child's disability. See, had they known their daughter was disabled, they would have killed her ahead of time, before she was born. Our society is not only willing to turn its back on the most vulnerable among us, but also to slaughter them for profit. In the introduction, I detailed just how lucrative the child-killing business is. There is no negotiating with that level of man's inhumanity to man, just as there was no negotiating with Jim Crow, nor was there any negotiating with slavery. Yet negotiating with child killing is exactly what the pro-life movement has been doing for 40 years. And by doing so, it has surrendered the moral high ground of its moral crusade. By focusing on regulating child killing, rather than focusing on defending the sanctity of human life, the pro-life movement/industry has raised untold millions of dollars for political activism, and has certainly contributed to the rapid decline of available abortion clinics in America today. We applaud that. But sadly, we're not any closer to overturning Roe v. Wade than we were decades ago, regardless. That's because as pro-lifers, we're actually not even arguing the sanctity of life most of the time, but the quality of life instead, which is exactly the argument of the pro-aborts. Pro-aborts use quality of life arguments to justify child killing. They ask questions like, is the child wanted? Will the child be born with a disability? Will the child be born into poverty? Was the child conceived via rape or incest? Is this child's mother a drug addict that can't possibly take care of him? These are all utilitarian, quality of life questions. Sadly, the pro-life movement/industry has largely adopted a similar utilitarian construct. The premise of the pro-aborts may be utilitarian, but the tactics of the pro-life movement often are as well. For example, we argue that all life is sacred, but then we seek out legislation that doesn't try to end child killing but seeks to put restrictions on it, like waiting periods before killing your kid. But then once the threshold is met, a mom can still kill her baby. As pro-life champion and former California Congressman Bob Dornan once said, if it ends with, and then you can kill the baby, it's not a pro-life bill. Another example would be so-called fetal pain bills. These well-intentioned bills are based on Supreme Court precedent dealing with when the fetus feels pain. First of all, why pro-lifers would use the language of the child-killing industry in the first place is beyond me. It's not a fetus, it's a baby. Not to mention, these bills basically rely on the reporting of butchers willing to kill babies for a living in order to enforce them. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone, I refuse to refer to them as doctors, is sleeping well at night after dismembering unborn babies for a living, I probably wouldn't trust them too much. Or am I the only one that watches those Lila Rose YouTube videos when she catches Planned Parenthood workers lying all the time? Remember Kermit Gosnell, the baby butcher of Philadelphia. Sworn testimony in open court during his gruesome trial, including witnesses describing one baby born alive as, quote, making this screeching noise that made it sound, quote, like a little alien, right before Gosnell killed the 18 to 24-inch newborn. Does Gosnell sound like someone you would trust to accurately report prenatal data? Furthermore, by ending child killing strictly on the basis of when the baby in the womb feels pain, we are not holding the moral high ground of the sanctity of life. Rather, we are surrendering the moral high ground by advancing the utilitarian position of the quality of life instead. In other words, we're protecting the child on the basis of when it can feel pain, not on the basis of when it's actually a child. Now might be a good time to define utilitarianism, which is a humanistic ethic/philosophy based on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for the most public and/or individual good. It's a totally subjective standard, not based on moral absolutes, but rather what's best for the whims, desires, impulses, and preferences for those wanting to justify their actions. Utilitarianism was a driving philosophical force in the former Soviet Union, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Utilitarianism runs contrary to the laws of nature and nature's God, referenced in our founding document, which is the fixed standard embedded in the creation by the Creator himself for our own good, and is so obvious our founding fathers called it self-evident. Utilitarianism allows ethics to evolve based on what individuals or societies prefer or believe is optimal at the time or necessary to drive their materialistic bottom line. Meanwhile, the laws of nature and nature's God is an objective moral standard that is always what's best for individuals and societies because it is the very blueprint devised by the living God in whose image we are all made. Violating his moral law is just as foolish as violating his laws of physics. For instance, a man may have a great desire to fly. He wants to fly more than anything in the world, but the problem is he doesn't have wings or any other anatomical appendage that lends itself to flying. Still, his desire is to fly. He finds others who share his desires. He hires lawyers to sue for his right to fly, and lobbyists to advocate for laws allowing human flight, regardless of what our anatomy allows. After raising enough of a ruckus, he finally finds a human authority that validates his right to fly. Still, he has no wings. Nevertheless, ruled by nothing other than his own passions, he climbs to the top of the highest building in his hometown. Convinced because of his innate desire to fly that he must have the right to soar through the air, he flings himself off the top of the building. But what happens? Splat happens. Regardless of how he felt, he still ran smack dab into the natural law of gravity.
And that was the beginning part of this chapter from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Law for February the 3rd.
February 3rd. You have one goal. Wisdom is not a product of schooling, but of the lifelong attempt to acquire it. Albert Einstein. The principle is simple and must be engraved deeply in your mind. The goal of an apprenticeship is not money, a good position, a title, or a diploma, but rather the transformation of your mind and character. The first transformation on the way to mastery. You must choose places of work and positions that offer the greatest possibilities for learning. Practical knowledge is the ultimate commodity and is what will pay you dividends for decades to come. Far more than the paltry increase in pay you might receive at some seemingly lucrative position that offers fewer learning opportunities. This means that you move toward challenges that will toughen and improve you, where you will get the most objective feedback on your performance and progress. You do not choose apprenticeships that seem easy and comfortable. Daily Law. Practical knowledge is the ultimate commodity. Evaluate opportunities using one criterion, the greatest possibility for learning. Mastery, Chapter 2. Submit to reality, the ideal apprenticeship.
And that was the Daily Law for February the 3rd. You have one goal from the Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Criticize another person only in the measure that you are willing to help the person deal with the problem that you're raising. You know, you're critical of someone, maybe legitimately so. All right, to what degree are you willing to help that person deal with the problem? No, I'm not willing at all. Well, then keep your mouth shut. Then don't say anything. If you're totally unwilling to help, don't say anything. Yeah, I'm kind of mildly interested, in helping. All right, then maybe offer a mild criticism. No, I'm in all the way. I'm willing to commit my entire self to helping you deal with that problem. Okay, then go ahead and criticize. Very, very good principle. I think a lot of hurt feelings and resentments and all that would clear up if we follow that principle.
And that was Bishop Robert. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, in Western Europe, in the pre-industrial Middle Ages, man's life expectancy was 30 years. In the 19th century, Europe's population grew by 300%, which is the best proof of the fact that for the first time in human history, industry gave the great masses of people a chance to survive. If it were true that a heavy concentration of industry is destructive to human life, one would find life expectancy declining in the more advanced countries. But it has been rising steadily. Anyone over 30 years of age today, give a silent thank you to the nearest, grimiest, sootiest smokestacks you can find. Unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, a right-thinking Democrat, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican. We are the true party of government. We are the ones that love government. The Democrat Party just loves power. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War. We continue on with Chapter 12, Lose the Battle, but Win the War.
Man might seem cold, his rationality sucking pleasure out of life. Not so. Like the pleasure-loving gods on Mount Olympus, he has the perspective, the calm detachment, the ability to laugh that come with true vision, which gives everything he does a quality of lightness. These traits comprising what Nietzsche calls the Apollonian ideal. Only people who can't see past their noses make things heavy. Alexander, the great strategist and man of action, was also famous for revelry and festivity. Odysseus loved adventure. No one was better at the experience of pleasure. He was simply more reasonable, more balanced, less vulnerable to his own emotions and moods, and he left less tragedy and turmoil in his wake. This calm, detached, rational, far-seeing creature, called prudent by the Greeks, is what we shall call the grand strategist. We are all of us to some extent strategists. We naturally want control over our lives, and we plot for power, consciously or unconsciously, angling to get what we want. We use strategies, in other words, but they tend to be linear and reactive, and are often fractured and struck off course by emotional responses. Clever strategists can go far, but all but a few make mistakes. If they are successful, they get carried away and overreach. If they face setbacks, and setbacks are inevitable over a lifetime, they are easily overwhelmed. What sets grand strategists apart is the ability to look more deeply into both themselves and others, to understand and learn from the past, and to have a clear sense of the future to the extent that it can be predicted. Simply, they see more, and their extended vision lets them carry out plans over sometimes long periods of time, so long that those around them may not even realize that they have a plan in mind. They strike at the roots of a problem, not at its symptoms, and hit their mark cleanly. In moving toward becoming a grand strategist, you follow in the path of Odysseus and rise toward the condition of the gods. It is not so much that your strategies are more clever or manipulative as that they exist on a higher plane. You have made a qualitative leap. In a world where people are increasingly incapable of thinking consequentially, more animal than ever, The practice of grand strategy will instantly elevate you above others. To become a grand strategist does not involve years of study or a total transformation of your personality. It simply means more effective use of what you have: your mind, your rationality, your vision. Having evolved as a solution to the problems of warfare, grand strategy is a military concept, and an examination of its historical development will reveal the key to making it work for you in daily life. In the early history of warfare, a ruler or general who understood strategy and maneuver could exercise power. He could win battles, carve out an empire, or, at the very least, defend his own city or state. But problems came with strategy on this level. More than any other human activity, war plays havoc with emotion, stirs the animal within. In plotting war, a king would depend on things like his knowledge of the terrain and his understanding of both the enemy's forces and his own. His success would depend on his ability to see these things clearly. But this vision was likely to be clouded. He had emotions to respond to, desires to realize. He could not think his goals through. Wanting to win, he would underestimate the enemy's strength or overestimate his own. When Xerxes of Persia invaded Greece in 480 BC, he thought he had a perfectly rational plan. There was much he had not taken into account, and disaster followed. Other rulers actually won their battles, only to grow drunk on victory and not know when to stop, stirring up implacable hatred, distrust, and the desire for revenge all around them, culminating in war on several fronts and total defeat. As in the destruction of the warlike Assyrian Empire, its capital of Nineveh eternally buried in the sand. In cases like that, victory in battle brought only danger, exposing the conqueror to ruinous cycles of attack and counterattack. In ancient times, strategists and historians from Sun Tzu to Thucydides became conscious of this recurring self-destructive pattern in warfare and began to work out more rational ways to fight. The first step was to think beyond the immediate battle. Supposing you won victory, where would it leave you? Better off or worse? To answer that question, the logical step was to think ahead, to the third and fourth battles on, which connected like links in a chain. The result was the concept of the campaign, in which the strategist sets a realistic goal and plots several steps ahead to get there. Individual battles matter only in the way they set up the next ones down the line. An army can even deliberately lose a battle as part of a long-term plan. The victory that matters is that of the overall campaign, and everything is subordinated to that goal. This kind of strategy represented a qualitative advance. Think of chess, where the Grand Master, instead of focusing only on the move at hand and making it solely in reaction to what the other player has just done, must visualize the entire chessboard deep into the future, crafting an overall strategy, using the moves of the pawns now to set up those of the more powerful pieces later on. Thinking in terms of the campaign gave strategy a new depth. The strategist used more and more of the map. War on this level required that the strategist think deeply in all directions before launching the campaign. He had to know the world. The enemy was just one part of the picture. The strategist also had to anticipate the reactions of allies and neighboring states. Any missteps with them, and the entire plan could unravel. He had to imagine the peace after the war. He had to know what his army was capable of over time, and ask no more of it than that. He had to be realistic. His mind had to expand to meet the complexities of the task, and all this before a single blow was exchanged. Yet strategic thinking on this level yielded limitless benefits. A victory on the battlefield would not seduce the leader into an unconsidered move that might ultimately set the campaign back, nor would a defeat unnerve him. When something unexpected happened, and the unexpected is to be expected in war, the solution he improvised to meet it would have to suit goals far on the horizon. His subordination of his emotions to strategic thought would give him more control during the course of the campaign. He would keep his perspective in the heat of battle. He would not get caught up in the reactive and self-destructive pattern that had destroyed so many armies and states. This principle of campaigning was only relatively recently christened grand strategy, but it has existed in various forms since ancient times. It is clearly visible in Alexander's conquest of Persia, in the Roman and Byzantine empires' control of vast territories with small armies, in the disciplined campaigns of the Mongols, in Queen Elizabeth I's defeat of the Spanish Armada, in the Duke of Marlborough's brilliantly conceived campaigns against the Habsburgs. In modern times, North Vietnam's defeat first of the French, then of the United States, in the latter case without winning a single major battle, must be considered a consummate use of the art. Military history shows that the key to grand strategy, the thing that separates it from simple garden variety strategy, is its particular quality of forethought. Grand strategists think and plan further into the future before taking action. Nor is their planning simply a matter of accumulating knowledge and information. It involves looking at the world with a dispassionate eye, thinking in terms of the campaign, planning indirect, subtle steps along the way whose purpose may only gradually become visible to others. Not only does this kind of planning fool and disorient the enemy, for the strategist, it has the psychological effects of calm, a sense of perspective, flexibility to change in the moment while keeping the ultimate goal in mind. Emotions are easier to control. Vision is far-seeing and clear. Grand strategy is the apex of rationality. Grand strategy has four main principles, distilled below from case histories of the most successful practitioners of the art. The more you can incorporate these principles into your plans, the better the results. Focus on your greater goal, your destiny. The first step toward becoming a grand strategist, the step that will make everything else fall into place, is to begin with a clear, detailed, purposeful goal in mind, one rooted in reality.
And that was the next part of Chapter 12, Lose Battles But Win the War, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we pick up where we left off with the enemies of my country.
32. Cantor stepped out of the small toilet nook on the plane, zipping up his fly as he swept his eyes across the cabin. His team was once again aboard an Air Force C-17, though this flight differed considerably from their high-altitude infiltration into Syria. Gone were the oxygen masks and tactical kit. The cabin was fully pressurized and filled with huge metal containers held to the floor by ratchet straps. This was no first-class plane arrangement. They were aboard a routine flight, practical stowaways added to the passenger roster at Duchess's command. The team was in civilian clothes and spread across the cabin in varying degrees of comfort. Worthy had unrolled a sleeping pad atop one of the cargo containers and was currently asleep, while Riley sat in a drop seat, resuming his progress in the same stupid paperback he'd been reading before infill. Ian took the cake, having strung a hammock between two containers and resting in it as peacefully as if he were on the beach, though whether awake or sleeping, Cantor couldn't tell. Cantor felt a dim sense of pride as he looked across the men. He liked to run a tight ship with the team, and wasn't the type to become overly emotional. And in part, he did this job for the sheer thrill of combat, sure. But beneath it all, Cantor loved warriors. Even the ones trying to kill him were cut from the same cloth he was, and when that commonality extended to the men fighting alongside him, it bred a degree of loyalty so absolute that not even Cantor could shake it. But at present his concerns fell to the last remaining member of his team, David, currently brooding in a seat at the back of the plane. Cantor grimaced at the sight. His young team leader was deep in some furious thought, looking as if he were about to burst into flames at any moment. Cantor sauntered over to him and dropped into a seat, speaking without introduction. You figure out the target yet? David looked over as if he'd just noticed Cantor was there, then returned his gaze to the aircraft's shuddering floor. No idea. But once we get back, Ian's not going to sleep until he figures it out. Cantor glanced over at the hammock, its occupant a motionless shape. Looks like he'll be pretty well rested by then. A sudden gust of turbulence rocked the plane, and Cantor steadied himself as he continued. You do realize what you're asking the boys to do, right? What do you mean? Oh, I don't know. Going off the legal grid, subjecting ourselves to prosecution and incarceration at an agency black site for the rest of our natural lives. I asked if they were in. Everyone volunteered. Of course they did, same as you would have for any of them. Doesn't change the stakes. The second we take agency weapons out of our facility, there's going to be hell to pay if Duchess finds out. She'll crucify us. Literally. Even if we just gain some intelligence and pass it along to her. Well, that's life in the fucking fast lane, David said. Put yourself in my position. Pretend it's your wife and kid on the line. Well, he corrected himself. Imagine you had a wife and kid, and then pretend they're on the line. There's something bigger at play here. We don't know what. And I'm not going to leave it to the agency to figure it out. So we do, he repeated, emphasizing his next three words, whatever it takes. Cantor cracked the knuckles on his left hand, then the right, considering that there may be a mentorship opportunity in the middle of this train wreck that was the aftermath of their second operation in Syria. Slow down there, young Padawan. What happened to the guy who was so fucking touchy about letting Elias interrogate that logistician, so grievously concerned about our operational authorities in Syria? That was before my family was involved. Oh. Cantor turned his palms skyward. So now you're willing to do whatever it takes, now that it's your family and not someone else's. David's brow furrowed. Yes. No more born-again Christian sentimentality? Not this time. Raising his voice over the wind that once again pitched the plane, Cantor said, It's all or nothing, David. You want to survive in this business. You can't pick and choose your stance. David spun sideways and grabbed Cantor's shirt front, pulling his face close. I don't need a lecture from you. My family's in danger, and we're goddamn well going to deal with it, however we need to. Cantor's eyes never wavered, and he felt his lips spreading into a wide grin. You may not like what I have to say. You may not agree, but you do have to listen. And don't get me wrong, I like the new you. David let go of his shirt, glancing around the cabin to see if anyone from his team had just witnessed his loss of control. Cantor didn't care either way. They weren't colleagues on some corporate retreat. They were shooters, plain and simple, immersed in a business that was messy at best and fatal at worst. Cantor continued, Now you're seeing the situation for what it is. I told you before that the biggest difference between us and the terrorists is our methods. So take this pain you feel and use it as a lesson. What we do has consequences, and the cost of us failing to kill a target could be hundreds or thousands of civilian lives. They may not be your family, but they're someone's family. Remember that. We can discuss your philosophical leanings when my family is safe. We're discussing it now because your family already is safe. You just don't realize why. David looked at him sharply, his nostrils flaring. Yeah? I must have missed the press release. Why are they safe? Cantor smiled again, a leering wolf's grin. Because you've got me.
And that was Chapter 32 from The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.